Alright, everyone. Welcome back. This is one of the teaching assistants. Her name is Willie. She has one eye. She's quite rambunctious. She'll be grading a lot of your pack-back discussions and exams, and, you know, she's maybe the real professor in some ways. Alright. Ready? Alright, get out of here. Okay. So, just to jump right in, on May 1st, as you know, you have this extremism paper that's due where you're applying some of the ideas from Kassam to the Shiro readings and my lectures on the French and Russian revolutions. So, for example, you want to talk about things like the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks, who is extremist, in what way, ideologically, by method, or by mindset. And then I also posted a rubric, you know, after kind of talking about this in class the other day, that basically kind of breaks down the points. So 15 points for a basic description of the French Revolution, just kind of, you know, kind of like a chronology of the major events discussed. And then you'll want to apply the different ideas of different types of extremism, ideological, by method, and mindset. Hold on, I got to get my cat in another room. Okay. And then you'll be doing the same thing with the Russian Revolution. So, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can email Oscar as well. And I look forward to having some good papers if they're, you know, as good as the discussions on pack-back. Okay, so jumping right in, this lecture may be a little bit shorter than the full class period, but oops. So again, kind of advertising our guest speaker, one of our guest speakers. Toward the end of class, I did want to bring up one of her earlier books, Word Slut, and the ways in which language has been used to essentially, you know, have very negative effects on women, and, you know, maintain systems of patriarchy and so on. And I think, you know, in terms of extremism, we see people turn to extremism and extremist beliefs oftentimes during times of, you know, of chaos or change, you know, tumultuous times, that kind of thing. And that's when you see sort of, you know, explosions in terms of cultish behavior and sort of looking at new religious movements and things like this. And I think it's important, too, that we understand some things that are happening. So, you know, we tend to focus mainly on, oftentimes over, maybe disproportionately focus on men in extremist groups, and there's some evidence that there are more men, but nevertheless we also know that there are a lot of women that join extremist groups. And something that has been, I think, worrying for some time is what we're seeing with young women in these days. Since 2009, you see this explosion in terms of young girls who are going to the hospital for self-harm. This is age 10 to 19, not so much for boys. Other data here, looking at boys' hospital admission for self-harm, not, you know, hasn't really changed a whole lot since 2001. When we look at it for girls, however, it's quite dramatic. So this is, again, hospital admissions for non-fatal self-harm. Went up 62% for girls in their later teens. For the early 20s, about 17%. But here's the real kind of worrying number. Since 2009, there's been an increase in, you know, self-mutilation by girls age 10 to 14 by almost 200%, 189. That is alarming. And the question is, you know, what's the effect of this? We know what this has caused this. You know, social media is a big part of it. Instagram, the constant evaluation and of people's looks and language, and how these things have an impact on women's self-esteem. And so again, a lot of these girls are now, growing up and in their 20s and things like that. So again, it's as a sociologist, we know that there are impacts, and will not only impact them psychologically, but will have social and political implications too, and that are just not clear, but are worth thinking about already. Okay, so today, to get right into more of it, I'm going to briefly go over the extremist mindset. This is the last of the three main kinds of extremism that Kassam identifies. And this one is basically, it's also, the psychology of extremism. And I have a degree in psychology along with sociology. I teach social psychology classes, so I did enjoy this part of it, and we'll talk about it even more on Tuesday next week. So I'm also going to ask that you view this video about given by a video of a talk given by Andrew Marantz, and I've got the link actually at the end of this lecture, so I'll just wait till I get there. So kind of the focus on this last chapter in Hate in the Homeland is the way in which a lot of these extreme right-wing groups are kind of finding out about one another and joining and creating spaces online and through various different platforms. For a long time it was Twitter, and then Twitter began to have different rules, more strict rules in terms of what can be posted and things like that. And we'll see what happens with Elon Musk buying Twitter. Maybe it will make a difference, maybe not. We also know that another place was 4chan, which is kind of a defunct website. Famously can post anonymously, and was one of the most trafficked websites in the world for quite some time. Then it's kind of break off the 8chan website and kind of linked in with QAnon as well, as I kind of went over a little bit in class the other day. Other things that are going on, I think what's kind of interesting is that all these different platforms and all these different groups, not just in the United States but around the world, are kind of coalescing in some kind of strange ways. We see, I think, people have become disenchanted with sort of mainstream contemporary liberalism and some of the values which have been more focused on individual rights and individual justice rather than community. And I think that's, when you look across the left, the right, conservative, liberal, right now there's sort of a yearning for a greater sense of community, and maybe we should try to make something of that. Anyways, so there's a good article about this that was published recently. And we also have to remember that, there's plenty of fantastic studies and research showing that, President Biden is the president. There's also fascinating data on the attempts to overthrow the election, or overturn it, I should say. At the local level, state level, and as we learn more daily, at the level of the Trump White House. So that's pretty extreme. And most of it is essentially kind of, wanting to sort of anoint Trump in royalty. And we're sort of seeing some of this behavior across the political world right now. So in the book, Kassam talks about scenes from American Pastoral, where someone from a well-to-do family leaves to join a left-wing group and bomb something, and then they become very radical or extreme pacifists. And he kind of uses that to show how people can go from one form of extremism to another, even if they're sort of very opposed to each other, violence versus non-violence. I was wondering about the Weather Underground. It would be interesting to think about them as well in terms of different extremist movements. They were certainly ideologically extreme. Their methods were extreme, but since they tried to blow up buildings that would not harm people, and they went to great lengths not to have anyone killed. Does that make them more extreme or less extreme than maybe terrorists that do try and bomb places? Kind of depends on how you view extremism again. One of the other things, as we talk about psychology, the psychology of this, it's important. We sort of realize that there's a long history of this. David Hume, in his long book, Treatise of Human Nature, kind of lays the groundwork for a lot of later social psychology. He talks about calm passions and violent passions, and calm passions is when you don't have any disorder in your soul. Violent passions is when they tend to be stronger, feelings of anger, resentment, and we know that these are intense emotions. And for various reasons, social media has tended to draw out a lot of violent passions within some people, and then they have making perhaps a disproportionate impact on society. So one of the first things to understand about moral psychology and political psychology is that intuitions come first, strategic reasoning comes second. So oftentimes that's why the psychological perspective is so important, because otherwise you might think that you are constantly reasoning and that our actions are based off of rational calculation of cost and benefit of our decisions, when it's really much more complicated than that. It's oftentimes our emotions, our pre-conscious emotions that come into play, and those are formed by a lot of things: genetics, our upbringing, our exposure to various things in the social environment, and so it's important to recognize that in terms of how people engage with the world, and why it's perhaps easy for people to jump onto extremist attitudes. So Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist, wrote this book Mindset, where it's kind of this kind of self-help book, but she also recognizes an important aspect of psychology, which is sort of the general world views that you have. And Kassam looks at four main elements of this extremist mindset: preoccupations, which are things like kind of obsessions; attitudes, kind of like views about something; emotions, again, this our basic biological emotional response; and then thinking patterns, how we cognitively assess things and evaluate things. Now, as someone with a degree in both sociology and psychology, these things are all very complicated and intricately mixed together. So I include this link on Kassam's earlier work on conspiracy theories. You don't have to watch this, but it is there in case you would like to. And it's he has some interesting things to say, and obviously conspiracy theories, like extremism, very, very important topics of the day. So militant extremism, is a pan-cultural phenomenon, meaning that this is something we see across the world throughout history. It kind of varies in intensity and by social structure and so on. It was kind of examined, as I kind of talked about in a later lecture, in Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer. And the psychologist Saussure and his colleagues, they did a number of studies to kind of draw out, okay, can we test these ideas that were first theorized by Hefner back in the, by Hoffer back in the 1950s. So militant extremism then is a mindset rather than a personality trait. It's a way of sort of viewing the world. Now, it may be connected to personality traits, which is something I talk about in my political sociology class, and we're going to talk about a little bit later on. Basically showing that there are sort of psychological predispositions for different political attitudes, and which makes those very complex as well. So we find that extremists generally seem to be more influenced by these violent passions than others. And again, the question is, okay, chicken and the egg, did their mindset come first, or was it their exposure that made them more likely to be to fall into this sort of mindset? So what are the core components then of the MEM, the militant extremist mindset? Well, Kazam has that list that the researchers looked into, and they had 16 characteristics, which is really, as I say here, it's too broad to be useful, and then you look at those categories, and each of those could be picked apart a bit more too. That kind of shows that this is an area that really requires some more research. So if any of you are going on to graduate school or wanting to do research, extremism, there's something we need more research on. The F scale in authoritarian studies was a major scale that was used to determine whether people had like a fascist personality, and it later came the bedrock of this study, the authoritarian personality. But again, kind of like this study here, it had too many items for it to be useful. It just covered too much. So anyway, the preoccupations, these sort of vary in intensity. They sort of are expressive of attitudes. So you might be preoccupied with religious or ideological or racial purity because of attitudes toward purity. He talks about that. And we'll look at some interesting studies on purity and cleanliness and stuff like that. How physical cleanliness is actually related to sort of religious, spiritual, ethical purity, and so on. Excuse me. Okay. So when we look around at the world today, kind of getting into some of what's in the Miller-Idris chapter, she talks about the British journalist David Goodhart, who talks about these two groups, somewheres and anywheres. This kind of two societies around the world, especially in wealthier societies, are kind of increasingly having to are seeing these two groups. So somewheres are people that are people who live in their hometown and stay there, very rooted in the culture or neighborhood, whatever it might be. Very tied to the land, often the physical environment, the natural environment. And then there are anywheres, and these people tend to be more mobile, tend to move around a lot, generally less attached to local communities and institutions, generally more liberal, less nostalgic. And so a lot of people have pointed out that, there's sort of a tension here, and you see it throughout history, urban, rural divides, that sort of thing. And once again, we sort of see some of these same things. We also see that there are sort of white supremacist moves toward somewheres, to build somewheres that are talked about in the Miller-Idris book. And again, I think there's a focus on, as I said, a focus on men usually when we talk about extremism, but women are very important as well, and there are white women who, in these sort of extremist groups, are kind of accepting traditional roles that may be religiously motivated, and you see this movement in homesteading. And Miller-Idris talks about these cooking shows, these drywall installation shows that by the end of it there's a discussion. They're subtly making hints toward like white nationalism throughout the whole thing, and again they kind of are start off as being innocuous and about being free of pesticides and things like that. And so, but this has a very long history going back to Nazism and so on. Anyway, this is something to look at. So this new right that's emerging, they often look at Wakanda, the fictional place in the Black Panther movie. and the mythical homeland of Aztlan. And they kind of look at these as, well, these are some kind of racially homogenous places. We want to do the same thing for white people. That's the general argument. Okay, so again, just kind of reminding us that in the United States, and really the political systems that have been influenced by the U.S., there is this sort of paranoid, and there is a lot of paranoia, and this really leads to a lot of conspiracy theories that I think are increasingly important to understand. One thing that's fascinating is that most conspiracy theorists, they have a high degree, they require high standards of evidence to prove the conspiracy wrong, but not any for like the self-critical view of the conspiracy theory. Like, okay, who made this? Who could have made this up? And who could this conspiracy theory be benefiting? And why might people be spreading that information or misinformation around, and so on. It always find that kind of interesting psychologically. And I think some of this, though, it comes down to this anti-intellectualism. People, for various reasons, have lost faith in technocratic institutions and knowledge and expertise, and social media sort of levels everyone, and you can have can argue a Nobel laureate with a high school dropout or something like that. And I think, that this has led to this sort of distrust in sort of expertise. And experts have been wrong about, many things. The war in Iraq 20 years ago, coronavirus, and a range of many things. And this is something that sort of interests me too, as someone who is Scandinavian, of Nordic descent, that within white supremacist, communities and whatnot, there is this kind of lauding and kind of identifying, or attempt to identify, romanticizing with Nordic imagery and Norse mythology and a lot of this kind of thing. We also see what this sort of greening of hate happening. I kind of mentioned that before. There is a very strong movement of sort of eco-fascism, and this are nationalists, often white nationalists, who want to protect the environment, but they want to do so by also controlling the non-white population. So that's something that I think we're going to see more of as our political institutions kind of struggle with some of this stuff. Miller Idris talks about these different zones that are these spaces that she identified in Germany that would kind of help develop a kind of right-wing social ecosystem. There were gray zones, fraternities, military reserves, unions, zones of fear, which were kind of neighborhoods housing a lot of far-right groups. Now, we've heard Putin talking about, denazifying Ukraine, and the reason that he's using that is that, for one, Russia helped to defeat the Nazis in World War II, so there's a lot of pride there, national pride there, and there are some white supremacist groups. The Azov Battalion in Ukraine is a far-right group, and there have been white supremacists from other parts of Europe and the United States who, for the last few years, have gone over there, trained with them, and so on. But they're not powerful enough to really have a huge impact on the broader society. Not enough to destroy the whole country in an attempt to denazify. So one thing that I did want to point out that you'll probably be interested in is the Southern Poverty Law Center has these interactive maps. And this might help you find an extremist group to focus on in your for your research paper. You can look at it by year. You can look at it by state. You can type in your own state there. You can just kind of hover around and look at, say, California. What groups are here? There's Californians for Population Stabilization. That's actually what the type of group I was just talking about. They're anti-immigrant and, argue for very restrictive policies. The Realist Report, just a whole bunch of these different organizations. I'm from Nebraska originally. Global Faith Institute, lived in Pennsylvania. The Proud Boys. The Proud Boys is a very chauvinistic male organization. We'll kind of talk about them in more detail. But so anyway, this is here, and again, this might be a good place to find your organization. So anyway, I'll talk about that more in class next week too. So one thing that we see really started to take off in the kind of the last 5, 6, 7 years. Language kind of referring to the Matrix and other sci-fi started to talk about this red pill and blue pill, and take the blue pill and you're going to be trapped in this fake world, the red pill, and you see the world as it is, which is basically not politically correct, not liberal, not egalitarian, and so on. And these are men's right groups. Some would say that they're male supremacists, however you want to look at it. There's fairly broad views within some of them. They're becoming more diverse. For example, one sort of group, so to speak, is men going their own way, where they basically, are sick of women and want to do things on their own. Kind of interesting. And they put out things kind of like this, like what sort of benefits do women offer for men? Sex, emotional support, and status. And anyway, women evidently get free dinners, his money, so to speak, all these different things which are quite presumptuous and don't actually match the world that exists. Because, for example, his money, we're increasingly saying that's increasingly her money as well. Free dinners, I don't know if that's necessarily quite what's going on. It's a very sort of transactional view of human relationships, which I kind of think is interesting too. And, that kind of, we can look at that and see, parts of Western civilization there, but also just trading civilizations as well. Anyway, so red pilling is this way to get people into their way of thinking, oftentimes extremist. And there's all sorts of codes and things like that we'll be talking about in the Miller-Idris book. Another one of these groups that kind of developed in Europe, but is located now increasingly around the world, and the United States in particular. Developed in 2018 and grew quite quickly. I think what led to its quick growth and why it's fairly relevant is because, neo-Nazism, white supremacism, white nationalism, for like 30, 40 years was, characterized by men who had shaved heads and wore Doc Marten boots and things like this. And, there's this sort of recognition that, they'd be more successful if they tried to look presentable. And so that's what you've seen, where you've seen basically the blazer and the cardigan have replaced the swastika and the Iron Cross. This group and others are very influenced by philosophers Martin Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche has a huge influence on people across the political sphere. People across the New Right are really obsessed with the notion of time, and a lot of that has to do with demographic change, but also sort of mystical cycles. There's a lot of that stuff going on in this New Right, this more extremist right. So Nietzsche, I just finished teaching a class where we read a lot of Nietzsche at Penn State, a seminar, and he's a very interesting thinker, and you can find a lot of sort of arch conservative views there. I think he's definitely more conservative than liberal, but he was opposed to religion, kind of an aristopopulist, as some people have said. Heidegger was another famous German philosopher, had huge impact across the world. also was a Nazi for some time, tried to hide it. Pictures came out of him in Nazi uniform, and then his diaries came out, and everyone realized he was, quite more of a Nazi than people thought. So, as I said, there's been a lot of changes in sort of these sort of extremist groups, especially since, say, back when I was your age, back when I was in my 20s and so on. Or maybe they've become more popular. I think that's what's really been kind of happening, is that sort of philosophies and ideas, extremist ideas that have been there for a long time, now are able to spread through the internet. And you see this kind of strange merger of beliefs isn't just today, isn't just contemporary times. We see it in the past as well. So there's this very interesting person named Savitri Devi, very peculiar. So she kind of developed this, she was British, grew up in England, and then kind of spent a lot of time living in Egypt and India and the United States as well. And she developed this Hindu Aryan myth and became this very prominent neo-Nazi after the Second World War. And she emphasized the environmental aspects, returning to the soil and that kind of thing. And she believed that Adolf Hitler was basically a type of god here on Earth. And so she was sort of vegan and things like this. She spent the Second World War kind of in India, but kind of, working with Nazis or something. Anyway, so she died back in the 1980s, but she's had sort of a rebirth of interest now in extremist circles. So this person is vegan in the style of Savitri Devi. These are a vegan far-right group, that have a cooking channel. So again, a lot of interesting different ideas that are merging in kind of some alarming ways. So back in about 100 years ago, a little bit more, you had the Italian fascist and futurist movement. A guy named, last name Marinetti, I forget his first name. He wrote this futurist manifesto, and it was basically a fascist manifesto. He says, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for women." So, very elegant stuff about war and patriotism and so on, and then in contempt for women. So has been a key part of a lot of extremist groups. As I said, there are more men who tend to be extremists than women, but again, it's not only that, and it's important to pay attention to the interesting gender divisions within extremist movements, because there's a lot of disagreement, which leads us right into a lot of a specific group. So your extremist group is going to be something like this. You're obviously writing a paper to profile a group, but you'll be kind of doing some of the stuff that I'm looking at here. So there's a guy named Jack Donovan. Maybe you might be familiar with him or not. And he basically is a white supremacist, and basically says, gave the speech where he says that white men have done more throughout history than anyone else. We're really good at it, and we have to get rid of this kind of universal morality and become tribes again. So Jack Donovan he's gay, first of all. He also believes that human equality is a lie, that violence is necessary, and that we can only have exclusionary tribes, and that's the only way you can have realistic ethics. So his main contribution to this kind of extremist right-wing thought, is a doctrine, a very well-structured doctrine of male tribalism. It's a sort of an ideological space that kind of focuses on warrior camaraderie. It's on the far right, but it's kind of meta-political, you might say. So male tribalism, male supremacism, if you want to call it that, is distinct from, but often associated with white supremacism. So this is Jack Donovan, famously very built and so on. He is as I said, he himself is gay, but he is opposed to same-sex marriages, which is kind of odd. But anyway, that's his argument. So he has joined this group, or was a former member of this group called the Wolves of Vinland. We'll talk about it in a moment. And this is a Virginia group that's kind of neo-pagan. So he rejects same-sex marriage on the grounds that society needs to foster traditional nuclear families, and so he basically believes that gay men could have their relationships with other men in the tribe, and it would be something like ancient Greece or ancient Greece and ancient Romans. And he believed that women should be there for the taking. Male tribes would fight over women. Kind of going back to tribalism, essentially. So he talks about rituals a lot that different groups could get into. He's written a number of books on these things, like The Way of Men. He is opposed to modernity. He sees it as something that is, taking away from, the natural order of things, of what he believes, at least, is the natural order of things. Again, he tends to kind of focus on gangs, and he believes that, gangs and tribes, that, these are the organizations that society should be built upon. And it's because of this. He also, as I said, relies on Norse mythology and Odinism, and he references a wide range of people, such as the right-wing author, far left-wing author, Noam Chomsky, the black feminist who just died a few weeks ago, Bell Hooks, and she actually writes with her name purposely lowercase. Yukio Mishima, a kind of right-wing gay bodybuilder, author, poet of the 20th century, Yukio Mishima, and Ernst Jünger, a German author. Interestingly, he does not cite any of the European New Right theorists, which kind of sets him apart from a lot of people in the contemporary right in the United States that have looked to European groups for inspiration, that have extremist groups that have been around for longer. So as I said, he is part of this group, the Wolves of Vinland, this male chauvinist group. It draws on Norse and Germanic paganism, Julius Evola's traditionalism, the manosphere, motorcycle gangs like the Hells Angels, mixed martial arts, things that we'll go into more detail about in the weeks ahead. And they do things like these sort of fights to prove their manliness. They also do animal sacrifices and things like that. So the organization has grown. It has branches in many European countries, as well as Russia. Russia's a European country and Asian. And it was founded just in 2006 in Lynchburg, Virginia. So again, as I said, they kind of view themselves as society needing to become broken down into tribal units. So just a few months ago, there was the shooting a couple days after Christmas in December of 2021 in Denver. It turned out this guy, Lyndon McLeod, who you may remember, he wrote this novel and published it, and it was kind of laid out this scenario that he lived out, and it kind of laid out this series of killings that he did in these tattoo parlors across Denver. So McLeod, if you maybe this kind of passed by the radar, but he was one of the Wolves of Vinland. He has been on podcasts talking about this stuff. He's an accelerationist. He's talked with Jack Donovan, a whole bunch of stuff like this. So, and he mentions Jack Donovan and Ted Kaczynski, I'll talk about in a moment, the Unabomber. And he kind of points out why, why they influenced him. So Donovan, obviously, his ideas on masculinity and tribalism and strength. Ted Kaczynski, he, if you don't know, was this guy from the 1970s to the 1990s. He sent out 16 bombs and he killed, I forget how many people, a few people. He targeted people working at airlines and engineers at universities. A lot of people thought he was called the Unabomber because he was acting alone, but it was actually because of university, UN for university, and A for airlines. And he was targeting people. It seemed arbitrary, but he had these reasons. They were part of the industrial world. He himself, in the 1970s, moved to Montana. He left Harvard he had a Harvard degree, and he moved into this 12 by 10 foot cabin there. He chose to only use technology that up to the year 1896. And so the most part he was off the grid. He did go to the local library quite a bit, and the FBI, when they raided the place, found 40,000 pages of his writing. And it was actually his brother who turned him in, because he noticed that the writing that the Unabomber was, sending to, the press and so on, these kind of manifestos, were very similar to what his brother Ted was doing, was writing up in Montana. So there is the Unabomber's little hut, his little cabin. It's in an FBI location right now, and it's probably going to stay there. But Ted Kaczynski himself, so he was arrested. He, in 1996, his manifesto was published by the New York Times. There were a lot of errors in it, but it did point to many things that environmentalists worry about, that, a lot of people across the political spectrum are worried about when it comes to things like pollution and, resource use and things like this. So he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He does actually write with pen pals. He's allowed to do a lot of writing still, and he carries on relationships with people. I've listened to some interviews with people who are like his pen pals. It's always kind of strange, but anyway. I personally don't understand why he's like 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. That doesn't seem very like much of a punishment for someone who lived for 20 years in a 10 by 12 foot cabin, but I guess whatever. Okay, anyway, so again, going back to the tribe. So I think one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that oftentimes people like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, even that name, as I said, a lot of us thought it was meant on their own. A lot of the mass shooters, they are acting alone. They're like, called a lone wolf. But if we think of them that way, then we're going to kind of miss out on what's going on. So wolves are they have packs. And so while some of these mass shooters, for example, may not be like this guy and actually part of the wolves of Vinland and then goes on this sort of lone wolf act, we should probably think of it in that sense, that, a lot of these mass shooters and, kind of extremists are reading the same materials, they visit the same websites, all this stuff is, they're engaging in online spaces. And anyway, so we're seeing these groups become more and more influential. Other things, as I said, talked about the Matrix before, very influential, and has, in terms of a cultural icon for this group, Ted Kaczynski, and then the movie and the book Fight Club. So if you've never read or seen them, you can watch them. They're kind of about these men who are living in this world where they feel that real men don't exist, and women have sort of emasculated men, and so people start these clubs and where they fight, basically. More to it than that, but that's about all I can say. If you want to watch it and not be spoiled. But so anyway, the author of that, there's a picture of him with Jack Donovan. They evidently only met like this one time, even though that looks like their best friend or something like that. But anyway, so this is a very important kind of model, I should say, for a lot of these extremist groups, these kind of male chauvinist groups. So I think one way to really kind of learn about them, kind of how this happened, is to sort of look at how it developed online. And I think there's a great way to do that. That doesn't require me. That's Andrew Marantz. He gives this talk on YouTube, and you can watch that. You can click on that in the PowerPoint. You can also just probably put it in YouTube, and it's his TED Talk. He did research for a few years on sort of online extremists over the last decade, and so it's pretty interesting. He got to know people offline, and that's sort of an interesting window onto this culture. And that is it. So next week we will kind of continue. We'll be talking about some of this stuff in more detail. All right, everyone, have a good weekend.